All right, well, let's get started while people continue to join. Welcome to the Elephant at the Table, Policy Pathways to Confront Power in Food Systems. This virtual webinar series explores how power inequities prevent a real food systems transformation. We start with the assumption that food systems are shaped by power, shaped by who controls resources, including land, water, and biodiversity, who decides which fishing or aquaculture models to support, which crops receive public funds, and many other dynamics. When power is ignored, efforts to transform the food system remain insufficient. So this webinar series draws on a year-long collaboration that our colleague Jose Luis Chicoma led while in residency in Hamburg, Germany, at the New Institute, where he was a program chair for this project on food and power. The collaboration during that year involved 8 scholars and practitioners who developed food policy recommendations to confront power in food systems across different sectors of the food system, including agroecology, seeds, affordable diets, governments, and today's focus, fisheries and aquatic foods, as well as other topics. So the series has covered the topics that are listed on the slide on the right-hand side. Today's session is the final session in the series this spring, focused on aquatic food and power. The series overall has been hosted by the New Institute, the organization Food and Planet, and the Food and Social Justice Action Research Lab at the New School. For today's session, we also have as co-hosts Blue Ventures and Smart Fish. We want to say thank you to the events and communication staff, the IT staff, and Cédric Gottfried, who is a PhD candidate in public and urban policy at the New School, for their assistance in running these webinars. Today, we'll share the moderation between 3 of us who have been involved or are involved today, and that is myself, Kristen Reynolds. I didn't introduce myself. I'm the chair and associate professor of food studies at the New School and director of the Food and Social Justice Action Research Lab. Chris Viliano, who is a postdoctoral researcher in global nutrition at Wageningen University, and research and co-founder and director of global research at Food and Planet. And we want to acknowledge the leadership as well of Jose Luis Chicoma, who was, again, the program chair for this project, and is current member of the high-level panel of experts on nutrition and food security. We will also have panel moderation by our main presenter today, Nicolás Robreño. We've been pleased to present this series and bring together such a rich diversity of experts from around the world in each session. And we will note that we've recorded the sessions and we'll be posting them online in the coming month. Along the way, we've also received requests to keep this series running in collaboration with other organizations working on food and power. So we're considering doing so in the coming year, covering issues such as gender and power in the food system, technology, land, and other critical topics. So you can keep an eye out for emails from the Food Studies program at the New School or the Food and Social Justice Action Research Lab with links to videos and announcements for the forthcoming series. So you can sign up for that listserv from the lab, which we'll put in the chat in just a minute. So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. First of all, Nicolás Robreño has over a decade of experience spanning from Latin America to the global stage. He was a fellow at the New Institute, working as an expert in aquatic food systems. Throughout his career, Nicolás has worked seamlessly across science, civil society, the fishing industry, and government. This multi-sector background allows him to align different perspectives with actionable policy, providing direct, strategic advice to ministers and vice ministers in the governments. He currently leads regional efforts to advance fisheries transparency at the Fisheries Transparency Initiative. So welcome so much. Our panelists today. First, we have Miftakul Kausar, who is the head of government relations in Asia Pacific from Blue Ventures, who has extensive experience in global fisheries, diplomacy, and advocacy for small-scale fishers' rights. He brings a strategic perspective that connects policy reform with community-led coastal action, strengthening social protection and sustainable livelihoods, while advancing food security and food sovereignty in the small-scale sector. Next, we have Cecilia Blasco, who is the executive director of Smart Fish, a Mexico-based organization working to strengthen small-scale fisheries through market-based approaches that improve livelihoods, traceability, and sustainability. Over the past decade, she's led development of the value rescue model, an innovative approach that helps fishing cooperatives cooperatives capture more value from their catch while incentivizing better environmental and social practices. And finally, Robin Davies is a global marine conservation leader currently heading up WWF's international marine fisheries effort, focused on bridging field level, biology with international policy and sustainability strategies, in addition to advocating for fishing methods that protect ecosystems while supporting livelihoods. He is dedicated to elevating the prominence of fisheries within global food systems and among high-level decision makers. And so I just want to extend a warm welcome to our speakers today and acknowledge how important and timely this focus on aquatic foods is in the global scheme of things, and particularly with climate change and global governance changes that are taking place as we speak. So during the presentations, you may feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to address those during that portion of the event. So now I'm going to hand it over to Nicolas for the presentation.
Thank you very much, Kristen, for the introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone joining. And today I wanted to share a brief take on the work that we were doing a couple of years ago with Jose Luis in Hamburg, drawing specifically from the aquatic food systems component, where we focus on understanding how power shapes food systems and outcomes. As many of you know, from your own work and experience, we are at a critical crossroad for aquatic food systems. And the challenges that we face today are not just technical, they are shaped by decisions, by the political and economical choices, and by the power dynamics behind all of this. In this work, we frame the analysis around three core questions, which you can see on the screen, which reflect the tensions that I'm sure many have encountered in their daily work. So basically, who food systems are designed for, how resources are prioritized, and who ultimately gets to decide. These questions often sit at a table as the elephant we all see, but we rarely name or confront. So how did we get here? We've gone from a long time in aquatic food systems in the way they've been organized from commons to commodities, starting from these ideas of the commons as fish being a shared, locally managed resource, which was closely tied to food and livelihoods. What followed was a transition, which was driven by a set of powerful drivers. We had, for example, refrigeration, which increased the scope and expanded the operation of fishing vessels. We also had industrialization, which scaled extraction. And then we had globalization, which connected fish to world markets. Over time, fish shifted from being mainly food to being treated mainly as a global commodity, with decisions mainly driven by scale, efficiency, and profit rather than local needs. And that logic is still currently structured in the aquatic food systems that we see today. This transition within aquatic foods has led or has translated into a different set of power, different power inequities. In this report, these dynamics are discussed in much greater detail. Here I just want to touch on them on a very high level, because together they shape who benefits, who bears the cost, and who gets a voice, for example. We have corporate concentration, and we are seeing an increasingly small number of actors that control all the different processing, distribution, trade, and these are shaping prices, standards, and access in ways that systematically disadvantage small producers, also keeping their voices out of discussions. This is closely linked to ocean commodification, in which marine resources are treated primarily as economic assets, where market value often outweighs food security and ecosystem consideration and local needs. In parallel, we see new forms of ocean neocolonialism or imperialism, for example. We have access arrangements between foreign countries and distant fleets, extracting value from coastal states that have limited resources and retain limited benefits and on the contrary, have long-term costs. Another key dimension is the subsidization and cost externalization. We've seen that environmental and governance costs are usually absorbed by the public, while profits remain largely private. And this, compounded to the fact that aquatic food systems and the SDG 14 remain usually underfunded at a global scale. At the same time, we have knowledge systems that are unevenly valued. We have traditional ecological knowledge and a Western knowledge, which have a certain dominance. And decision-making frameworks usually prioritize Western science, economic models, and sideline traditional ecological knowledge and local management systems. This ignored knowledge and also together with the unheard voices, these two problems overlap and also sideline some people from the decisions that shape their life. And finally, we have this luxury aquaculture fish meal paradox. Being from Peru, we have the anchoveta fishery, a small and very nutritious fish. And my country faces high levels of anemia and undernutrition, but most of these small nutritious fish is processed into fish meal and fish oil, mainly to supply aquaculture, often for high-value products such as salmon or the shrimp industry, which are then destined to export markets. Taking all these together, these are not isolated problems. They reinforce each other and concentrate power across the aquatic food systems. So one of the key takeaways from the work carried out by the entire team is that power cannot remain implicit if we want to change trajectories. And across aquatic food systems, power shapes decisions, incentives, and also outcomes, but often does this invisibly. And making it visible and willing to confront it is necessary to step up and open up different pathways. So if power is shaping trajectory, then the question becomes, in what direction do we actually want to move? And from our work, we suggest 3 shifts that can help define that direction. First, a shift from thinking of food as a commodity to food as a public good first. This places nutrition and food security at the center of decision-making. Second, we have a shift from dependence on a few species to a resilient, diversified system. And diversification strengthens ecosystems, reduces risks, and support long-term security, especially under a context of climate change. And third, shifting from a concentrated decision-making scenario to an inclusive, transparent, and accountable governance. This means broader participation with real influence over priorities, access, trade-offs. Taken together, these shifts point us towards a different way of ordering priorities within aquatic food systems. And if this is the direction we've proposed, then we need to see a way of how to start changing and moving into the direction. So navigating forward, we've proposed 4 major areas that stand out. We have first, reorienting public resources towards equity. This means phasing out harmful subsidies and fair fishing deals, and also recovering costs to cover management costs, and also to help and support small-scale fishers, small-scale producers, and shorter value chains. Second, we have the democratization of governance and decision-making. This can be reached out by creating institutional spaces where fishers, women, youth, indigenous communities, and other underrepresented groups have real influences over rules, access, and priorities. Third, ensuring that industry is accountable in cost sharing. This means that large industrial actors should contribute to the real costs of research, monitoring, management, and governance, rather than shifting these to the costs of the public through taxes indirectly. And fourth, there's also a way forward in decoupling the food production from this extractive dependence. This means prioritizing small pelagic fish, such as anchoveta, or in other places, other species, towards human consumption, and reducing the reliance of fish meal for high-value aquaculture products. These are some of the core recommendations that we've set, but the longer document that you can review has a set of 10 recommendations, and I'm just going to go very briefly on some of them. We have, for example, establishing procurement of fish from small-scale fishers, small-scale producer, and aquaculture. This can be a way also of providing a market for them. We also have another recommendation that seeks at prioritizing small pelagic fish for human consumption. And this includes shifting away from the notion that this is trash fish. There has been several narratives calling this small fish as trash fish. And when you hear trash fish or the fish that it's eaten by animals, you try to steer away from that. However, these are very nutritious species that can provide say, food security and livelihoods to coastal communities. It's also important to secure coastal rights and provide an inclusive governance to bring back the power of communities. And something that I was mentioning before, in the context of climate change, diversification is key. And instead of just focusing on a small group of key commodities, trying to open up into other species, promote local value chains with a diversified group of species. As I mentioned, this is developed in much more detail in the report, which you can look and review and explore. And looking ahead, we are also looking at editing a book that will expand further the ideas that we've been sharing over the series. And I just want to close by returning to the central insight from this work, that the most urgent step is to make power visible. In many cases, power has been the elephant at the table, sitting at the table, shaping the decisions, the priorities, the trajectories, without being named. And if we want to change that, we need to acknowledge and address those power inequities directly. Yeah, and that's it from my side from the presentation. We will share at the end the link, or I think, Kristen, you can share the link over the chat. And I think we've been introduced with the different panelists that we've been joined, that we appreciate their participation. And if you have any questions, you can include them into the chat box. In the meantime, we're gonna go through a guided panel session with our invited speakers. And first, I wanted to hand it over to Mifta, and I wanted to ask you, based on your perspective and the experience working with small-scale fishers, how can we achieve genuine participation through the effective representation of small-scale fishers in a people and nutrition-centered governance model?
Yeah. Can you hear me clearly, Nico?
Yeah, we can hear you,
Yeah.
Mifta. And just
Thank
to
you very
remember,
much.
you need to stay at 5 minutes per answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Very good presentation with very strong recommendation that you mentioned, Nico. Okay, to answer your questions, we need to understand that small-scale fishers are the backbone of coastal communities and food system across Asia specifically. But I think it's also work when we talk with the global context that SSF make a major contribution to food security and nutrition for millions of people. According to FAO data, the sector supports around 46 million livelihoods across the region, and women make up almost 40% of the sectors. But let me put in Indonesian context. Number of fisherfolk in Indonesia almost 3 million, and 93% of that are small-scale fishers. They feed coastal communities every day and make a major contribution to national food supply, nutrition, but many of them are still left out of decision about fishers, coastal development, and food system. From our perspective in Blue Ventures, sustainable small-scale fishers are key strong food system, better nutrition, and meaningful participation in governance. And to achieve, back to your question, to achieve a genuine participation for small-scale fishers, we first need to understand the reality of the reality they face every day. The problems. Many coastal communities are dealing with unstable fish price, weak infrastructure, climate impact, limited market access, and increasing pressure on fishing ground. In that situation, participation cannot simply mean inviting communities to consultation meeting after policies are already made. I mean, we need to put also small-scale fishers as the main actor of decision-making process. So, real participation starts when small-scale fishers are treated as main actors, as I mentioned, in governance and in decision-making process. From what we see in Indonesia, at least there is three things that really matters, Nico. First, fisher group and cooperatives must have a real seat at the table, especially in fishers management and marine spatial planning process. Second one, participation must come with fair economic support, better market access, better infrastructure for small-scale fishers, and social protections. The third, local knowledge. You mentioned that local knowledge also, we need to declare that local knowledge also important and must respect it. Small-scale fishers understand the sea, really understand the sea, fishing season, and coastal ecosystem because they live with the reality every day. So, in nutshell, for us, Blue Ventures, stronger food system will only happen when coastal community have more power to shape the decision that affect their life and livelihood. Thank you, Nico.
Thank you, Mifta, for those insights. I think it's important also to put into context the dimension of the fisheries in Indonesia, and I think those 3 points you raised are pretty important to put them in the center of the discussions. And now I wanted to go to another region, and I wanted to ask you, Cecilia, and also based in the work you've been doing in Mexico, how does empowering local value chains can translate into better livelihoods and put decision-making power back in the hands of small-scale producers?
Thank you, Nicolas, for the question and for the invitation to participate in the panel. So I'm going to talk from our experience with Smartfish, working with small-scale fisher cooperatives in Mexico. A lot of what you mentioned in your presentation and what's in the publication of The Elephant in the Room really resonates with our work. And I find this approach of using power as a way to approach the system really helpful. So the fishers we work with, like you mentioned, are price takers. They have a highly perishable product, and they're logistically very distant from market. So they are basically forced to sell to the intermediary at the beach. And they have no capacity to negotiate. So then there's a lot of price instability depending on how much is caught each day. So Smartfishes has developed what we call a value rescue model to change that dynamic. And by value rescue, we mean recovering value that is wasted through poor handling practices by the fishers themselves, leaving the fish out in the sun all day. Also by inefficient business practices by the cooperatives themselves. So fisher cooperatives are these really amazing organizations for achieving social and environmental value, but they're very challenging to manage as a business. So we have a team that's dedicated to finding better practices and helping the cooperatives adopt better, more efficient practices. The other component of value rescue is adding value locally in processing facilities, typically owned by the cooperatives in the communities, and typically the workers are generally women who have limited opportunity to fish. And this way they can retain more value locally, and freezing also changes the dynamic of the logistics. So by freezing, they're no longer forced to sell immediately a product that's going to rot unless they take the price of the buyer, and they can also make the logistics cheaper. The next step of the model is helping these cooperatives reach market with their high quality differentiated product that has traceability. And for this, we depend on intermediaries. One of those intermediaries is our own seafood company that was created from the NGO and that now has stores in Mexico City, sells to hotels and restaurants, and exports some seafood to the United States. And part of the model there is to negotiate with full transparency with the cooperative so that every party knows the costs and utility margins of each step of the supply chain. And then all of this, what we observe is that when fishers and fisher organizations have agency in their relationship with the market, they are much more invested in the management of the resource. And so Smartfish's support is conditioned on participation in a fishery improvement project, which is a market it's not a certification, but in our model, it plays that same role. So that's the value rescue model in a nutshell. What we observe is that market dynamics are very difficult to change. What we can change is how the fishers that we work with participate in these globalized markets. In our context, a little bit different from the paper, we're not dealing with any aggregation by large corporations. So power is much more atomized. It's very concentrated in those first intermediaries. And in our context, a lot of those first intermediaries are increasingly that role is increasingly served by organized crime organizations, which use a lot of violence to enforce agreements. So it's a very dangerous situation for the small-scale fisher cooperatives. I just wanted to make the world aware of this reality. Fortunately, with our model, we are able to increase fisher income by about 30%, while also reducing fishing, because part of the model is that all the fish that is landed has to be killed and bled, which reduces the catch per unit volume while increasing the income for the fisher organizations. And what we're also seeing is much stronger fisher cooperatives and a much stronger participation of women in the supply chain. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. I think it's important just to raise the point that seafood has a characteristic, which is that if you do not sell it, it rots. So fishers usually have little leverage and power, and some people can take advantage of that. And I value a lot the model that you've shared. And I think what's key is that this is a transition, and you are giving back agency and power to these cooperatives to start building their own livelihoods. So thanks for those insights. And now to finalize this first round of questions, I wanted to invite Robin to provide an overview from the global perspective, something that I raised during the presentation, which is funding. So we have this funding situation. So how do we break this cycle of underfunding for the SDG 40 to effectively be able to support sustainable and equitable blue food systems?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question, Nico. I think when we start to think about this question, it might just be worth sort of taking a step back and understanding why it is so important that SDG 14 is underfunded when we compare that to the importance of these fisheries, and especially later maybe when we talk about it in relation to coastal communities. So I think it's Miftah, you mentioned earlier some very important statistics, and I'll just underpin those further. So we know that 3.2 billion people depend on the ocean for 20% of their per capita animal protein intake, which is very significant. We also know that the food that comes from the ocean is extremely nutritious in terms of omega-3 fatty acids, in terms of vitamins A, B, and D, minerals, and micronutrients. And we often associate omega-3 with the fatty fish like tuna and sardines, forage fisheries, etc. But the micronutrient structure of or assemblage of micronutrients in white fish is also extremely valuable as well. So all fish basically have a lot of nutrient value, but also 600 million livelihoods come from the fishing industry, and that is actually roughly 7% of the global population. If you think about that in terms of agriculture, now agriculture employs more people, but then nearly 8 billion of us live on land. So to have 7% of our food resources coming from the ocean, I actually think is proportionally very significant. We also know that the ocean is incredibly important for the environment in terms of regulating global climate, absorbing heat and carbon. It produces half the oxygen we breathe. It has cultural and economic significance, and it really is underpinning, in many cases, global trade. So there's those couple of points. And then there's also something which I think, we don't often think about, but it's just how unique the ocean is as a food production system that requires very little inputs from us other than instigating management measures and ultimately the act of extraction itself. So what I mean by that is when I say we don't have to do much other than those two things, the energy inputs produce this massive amount of biomass that the ocean, when it's productive and well managed, can produce is incredible, and it's wholly subsidized by nature. As long as you have sunlight, as long as you have nutrient cycles, and as long as you have currents, you have the raw ingredients for the primary productivity upon which the phytoplankton is fed on, the zooplankton is fed on, the forage fisheries, etc., up to higher trophic levels, and you have a rich assemblage of animal species, if well managed, not always, that just produces an incredible volume of food and food security. And then, when you think about that in another way, what food production system offers such advantages? You don't have to sow any seeds, you don't have to plow the seabed, you don't have to weed, you don't have to use fertilizers, you just have to use pesticides. In other words, like I said earlier, everything, all those energy inputs come from nature. We just have to learn how to manage it properly. We're not always doing that. In many cases, we're not. But when we do, we can see how productive the ocean is. So that's a little package of thought that when you put together, seems completely remarkable. The SDG 14, and we talked about in the question, Nico, thanks for the question, it's underfunded. Well, that level of underfunding is 0.9% of all 17 SDG goals. So it's really one of the most underfunded of the Sustainable Development Goals for one of the most important food production systems. And that seems to me to be a remarkable disconnect between the reality of the importance of the ocean and the lack of understanding about that. And therefore, that is then reflected in this underinvestment. And clearly, it's just a very egregious example of a global policy blind spot. And I think, at the smallest level, webinars like this are really helpful. And then we can take that to progressively higher levels. But actions like this are important to continually hammer home that message. And that sort of gets to the question, how do we break this cycle of underinvestment? I think we've heard good thoughts so far. I have a couple of thoughts. I think it's a suite of actions, trying not to replicate what's already been said. I think ultimately we need to reframe oceans as a fundamental development and food system issue and not a niche environmental one. I think it's really important that this needs to be reflected, therefore, in public finance, development finance, and food systems policy. And making that point might be a way to start to make inroads into that disconnect. And then when we do get the money flowing, and the money that already is flowing needs to be invested into what we know works. We know that science-based management works. There's lots of papers showing that. We know that marine protected areas work. There's many other solutions too, but the point here, without listing all those out, is that the point we have to make to policymakers and those who hold the money that can increase the flows to dealing with this is that we're not asking for investment into a hopeless decline. We're asking for investment into one that can regenerate. I also think that the importance of food security provided by the oceans, but also environmental, social, and economic importance needs to be better reflected in accounting systems. And then we need to better integrate small-scale fisheries and coastal communities into the policy discussion, like we've already heard from previous answers, but it's worth reiterating. So ultimately, I think what we need to do, and we already are doing, but it just needs to be elevated, is making the point that ocean is not peripheral to human well-being, but actually is foundational to it. And I think only when you start to make those points do you start to get the attention of the people with the larger amounts of money, the decision makers, the policy makers. And when you connect it to the national security issues that they have interests in, then I think we can start to get to addressing this lack of financing. And then, just to end off, I think it's just a perpetual problem we always face. We're land-based animals and we're trying to create conservation in the water. And I think just fundamentally people understand land-based issues better than they do water-based issues. And that's our job to try and sort out through increased communication and making the points about just how important the ocean is to food security. So I'll leave it there, Nico. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Roy, for bringing that topic. I think funding is obviously very important for being able to do all of this fisheries management. We have all of the science already in place, but I feel that, as you mentioned, you brought it up, funding is maybe not discussed enough in the aquatic food space. And with that perspective, when you take one step back and look at all of the importance what fisheries and aquaculture represent, and then there might be this sort of disconnect or also misperception of the importance. I think it's important that we are working in this space. We start speaking more on that and trying to put the proper relevance and importance in a global discussion. So thank you very much for bringing that topic up. And now we are going to circle back again with questions, going back to Mifta. You already gave us a little bit on your experience and some insights on Indonesia. So I wanted to ask you what practical steps, and also looking at the work that you are doing that is very practical and hands-on, what practical steps are needed to build grassroots agency so small-scale producers can reclaim and also improve their local food systems?
Yeah, thank you, Nico, for the questions. I will start answer that with one important lesson from our partner in Indonesia. BV partner is a Indonesian Traditional Fisheries Union, KNTI. So through the Coastal Food Sovereignty Forum 2024, in that forum, KNTI strongly said that small-scale fishers consistently called for stronger representation in policymaking, fair market system, and better protection in fishing ground. So from what we see in Indonesia, Nico, the coastal community already have knowledge. We know that. Local food system, strong community network. The problem is that many small-scale fishers still have a weak bargaining power, unstable income, limited infrastructure, and too much dependent on middlemen, like Cecilia mentioned. So if we want to build stronger grassroots agency, we need to strengthen the position of fishers in the food system itself. What kind of practical step that we can address? The first step may be strengthening fisher group and cooperative. When fishers organize together, they have strong bargaining power, better access to market, and stronger voice in local decision-making process. And the second step may be like invest in infrastructure and local value chains. You mentioned that funding is very important. It's also important to make sure that funding directly go invest in infrastructure and local value chain, like cold storage for small-scale fishers, transportation, local processing, and direct market access with small-scale fishers. Because without these things, many fishers stay trapped in low-value supply chains. And the third step may be support women and young people in many fishing communities, because women play a huge role in seafood processing, household nutrition, and local markets, but they are still often left out a leadership spaces. So we need to also make sure that women and youth participation in decision-making process in fishing community also. And fourth step, last one, is connect local food system with climate resilience and social protections, because many coastal community are already facing climate impact and economic uncertainty. So yeah, I will put also last example from Pemalang, Central Java, where fisher group and local cooperative help fisher sell their catch collectively instead of individually. This gives them a stronger bargaining power, reduced dependence on middlemen who often control price. Over time, this helps improve household income and keep more economic value inside the community. So last thing for us as Blue Ventures, I mentioned again, local food system becomes stronger when coastal community have more control over market, resources, and decisions that affect their livelihood. Thank you, Nico.
Thank you very much, Mifta. I think those are very practical steps. And I just wanted maybe to make a quick follow-up. If you could provide maybe a little bit of context on KNTI, maybe some of the audience do not know, but if you could tell them a little bit about KNTI. This is a huge organization in Indonesia.
Yeah, so KNTI is one of BV partners. This is the largest small-scale fishers union in Indonesia with members more than 100,000 across region. Until now, maybe they have a member from 72 regencies in Indonesia. You know, Indonesia is archipelagic country. We have a lot of regencies, and 73 they have a member representative in 73 regencies in Indonesia. So this is one of the largest small-scale fishers union in Indonesia, Nico.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mifta. I just wanted for the audience to understand like the size of these organizations and the power that they can have, but also, as Cecilia raised, the difficulty of managing such a big organization, and also with a distribution among different islands.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you very much for your insights and also for that follow-up question, Mifta. And now moving on, I wanted to ask you, Cecilia, if you could reflect on the following question. I think you've also been raising it in some way, but how can promoting also a wider variety of catch rather than just a few species can also help build resilience and protect local food systems?
Thank you, Nicolas. This is a question that we deal with almost on a daily basis at Smartfish. We work in tropical and subtropical fisheries that are by nature very diverse, and yet the market logic looks for standardization, uniform sizes, uniform species. So we're dealing with this clash of realities of what the market is willing to pay for and what the ocean is able to give. And so what we also observe is that fishers really respond to market demand, and so they target the species that their first buyers will pay the best prices for. And those species, ironically, are often the least resilient biologically. So what we've been trying to do is to open markets for some of the less well-known, maybe more biologically resilient species. And we do this by focusing on the fish handling, so that what is called considered a secondary fish or trash fish in some cases has the same qualities as what consumers are looking for. So this has been a slow process. Chefs are very resistant sometimes to try new things, especially they're also resistant to try frozen fish. But slowly we have been able to build market for fishes, for species that are less well known in the market. We are able to reach a price point that is attractive to the consumers. And when the fish are of high quality and well handled, then consumers like them. So part of the model of bleeding the fish makes the fish less fishy, which is more attractive to the Mexican consumer who doesn't like very fishy fish, as opposed to maybe consumers in other parts of the world. So we think that bringing these lesser known species to the table of consumers is really important, both for the economy of the fish organizations, for the oceans, and to reduce waste. So a lot of what we do is trying to reduce waste. And one of the most wasteful practices that happen on the ocean is our discards. This high value, really good protein, as Robin was mentioned, that is taken out of the ocean and then discarded, thrown back in, because fishers can't find a market for it. So I think this is something that consumers can really help focus on, is making sure that we are consuming the variety of species that come from tropical and subtropical oceans, and understanding the impact of only eating snapper and grouper when we go to the restaurant.
Thank you, Cecilia. I really like that. Trying to make fish less fishy. I've heard that some people, fish flavor is too strong. So I think it's an uphill and a constant effort that needs to be done. But I think it has multiple benefits. You mentioned it's turning trash fish or waste fish or secondhand fish into income for fishers. So also it's reducing pressure over other species. So I think there's multiple benefits, and it's a very important effort that's been done by different organizations such as Smartfish. So thank you very much for that contribution. And now going back to you, Robin, for this final round, you spoke about the funding, the lack of funding that we need to turn around. But I also wanted to ask you related to these dominant food agendas and underrepresentation that we see sometimes in the international scenario. So, for example, what is, from your perspective, the cost of sidelining blue foods, for example, for coastal communities, local diets, and biodiversity? I think you're muted, Robin.
Thanks, Nico. Yeah, I think I can give you a sort of very immediate answer, is that when you think about small scale fisheries, for them, these fisheries are not opt-in. initiatives. You know, they are absolutely dependent on this resource. And so a lack of investment for them is actually quite consequential. So again, we start off by looking at some of the importance of this. 500 million of these small-scale fisheries rely on fisheries for at least part of their livelihoods. It represents 40% of the world's total fishery catch, and something like 2.3 billion people average 20% of their key nutrient intakes from these fisheries. So, like I say, these are extremely important fisheries and an extremely important resource to these local communities and small-scale fishers operating with them. And a lack of funding is just obviously going to have a really big impact on that if we can't manage them effectively. And lack of funding weakens local fisheries governance. It can lead to loss of territorial rights. We'll talk about that in a moment. It can lead to collapse of co-management models that are so important, and just ultimately institutional neglect. And some of the consequences of that can be quite serious. So no one wants to condone IUU fishing, but in some cases, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, I mean, but in some cases these fishers are almost forced into that because of the consequences of underinvestment. So in other words, you get enforcement disappearance. If you don't have the investment, that's what's going to happen. That's bad for management of the small-scale fisheries themselves, but it's also bad for the management that's necessary to ensure that industrial vessels don't encroach into what should be the grounds of the small-scale fishers. And therefore, just to survive, small-scale fishers have almost been left in some instances to have to go to IUU. And that's why you see some people getting quite concerned about the way we characterize IUU, because the U in the U, the unreported and unregulated, is food and security for these communities. And so it has to be dealt with very sensitively and carefully. And it creates data blind spots. So if you're not going to have the investment, you're not going to have the scientific monitoring, you're not going to have the essential basis for establishing the harvest controls that are so necessary for sustainable fisheries management. And it's just going to lead to increased impacts. So I think that's ultimately it. That's what there's other factors too, but that's sort of a summary of some of the impacts of the underinvestment. And we've seen this happen all around the world. We've had different examples. Part of my work involves working in Southwest Indian Ocean countries, where we've seen this regulatory vacuum manifest in exactly that way I was describing. It means those fisheries became exploited by foreign fishing vessels. Small-scale fisheries had to go to IUU out of necessity. They didn't want to; it just had to happen. But I think not to get too depressing, I think there are things that are helping. So in this region in particular, but there are other versions of help in the other areas. We just heard some examples, for example, but in Maputo, just outside the capital, Mozambique, just outside of the capital of Mozambique, sorry, Maputo, I mean, there's a monitoring, control and surveillance coordination center, which is essentially a specialized regulatory institute of the South African Development Center, countries, I mean. And this is crucial, and this is going to have a really big impact, and it's just becoming operational, and it's a big focus of attention. Part of that is also, we're talking about small-scale fisheries, but some of the international policy agreements can actually really help the small-scale fisheries. So we're trying to get countries in the region, but also countries globally, to sign up to a suite of agreements that in different ways tackle IUU, which is connected with the problems that small-scale fisheries face. And they are Port State Measures Agreement, the Cape Town Agreement, the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement of the World Trade Organization, and the International Labour Organization's Work and Fishing Convention, which tackle the issue of IUU through labour, through safety, through monetary flows, and through access to ports. And then something is very interesting, maybe just to highlight here, is our WWF colleagues down in the region have been working with partners to build a venture builder. It's developed with the understanding, like I was saying, that coastal communities are ultimately the best custodians of this resource because they are the ones who most depend on it. And what the venture builder aims to do, and there's similar tools around the world from other organizations, it aims to leverage that ready audience of the small scale fishers by bridging the gap between development finance and investing readiness, and hopefully that will give a pipeline of investable projects. So a couple of things just to round off briefly. These examples and others show that we can secure coastal waters and protect livelihoods of millions. But when we talk about this whole debate, I think we have to be really careful because it could be misinterpreted as an expansionist agenda. And I think a key point I'd like to make is we're not necessarily saying fish more. We're saying fish better because that will actually produce more fish. And there's a subtle difference. There's actually a very important difference between the two things, because I don't think we can just suddenly go out into the ocean and fish more, because it has a huge set of problems with the management system it's currently under. But if you can fish better, you can actually create a more healthy ocean ecosystem that by default will just produce more fish that can be caught, rather than an initiative to build more boats and go and catch more fish. So that's a really big difference and a really important point to make. Thanks, Nico.
Yeah, thank you very much, Robin. And I appreciate all of the comments from all of you. And thanks for bringing, I think, starting the question with some of the impact, what's at the line, what's at risk, but then also ending on a high note with some of the positives to also live with a positive outlook on what's the potential that things can improve. So we do not foresee we foresee a positive future in the short term. So with this, we end this panel discussion, and then I wanted to hand it over to you, Christine, to check any Q&A that might have come out.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for your comments and your presentation perspective. And I think that just kind of taking a step back from the discussion, the fact of having this work that you all do and this panel and the report chapter, Nico, are an example of some of the comments that you all made about bringing the topic of fisheries and aquatic foods to a broader level of recognition, as it often, I think, gets marginalized in many of the ways that you've all been talking about. So thank you so much. So there are a few questions. I'm going to try to group them so we can get to as many as possible. So maybe I'll ask the group, and you can answer as you feel so inspired. Thinking about the intersecting challenges of the effects of fossil fuel industries, development, urbanization, waste dumping, tourism, agriculture, all of these things, and the way that they are impacting oceans. What can be done to address these in order to protect seas? Does this involve some sort of fossil fuel treaty, other measures that you haven't already discussed? And this is open to anyone who would like to respond.
Yeah, I think I can jump in with a few ideas, maybe on some of the topics that you mentioned, Christine. I think we have this treaty on plastic that's been discussed for the past couple of years. I think eventually that's going to help a lot. Many of the single-use plastics. We've seen that in the marine space, at least the multilateralism is continuing to grow. We've recently have the BBNJ agreement, one agreement on international waters that's been signed. We also have a recent agreement on fishery subsidies that has been signed. Also a recent agreement on fishing vessels safety. So in the fishing realm, even though in the rest of the world things are not going very well, we have these good treaties that are being signed. So I think eventually that plastic treaty should help some of the contamination that's eventually happening from single plastic use. Obviously, there's a lot of sensibilization that needs to be done, but I think that gives us a good positive outlook in the future for some of those topics.
Thanks. Would anyone else like to weigh in on this question?
No, only the obvious point, which I suppose is as we do work on this issue, we do have to recognize that there are multiple ocean uses, and we can't work in isolation to the demands that those ocean uses are placing on fisheries. Because I work on fisheries all the time, but also very aware that that's not the only way the ocean is used. And we see different examples in different parts of the world as to efforts to do that, but ultimately it's stakeholder engagement. It just happens to be extremely challenging. But when you face that type of challenge amongst multiple different stakeholders, sorry not to give a very original answer, but it's probably the right answer, is that you just have to make sure you set in process the mechanisms to be able to have those multi-stakeholder discussions and a willingness to compromise, I'm afraid. I think that's the only way it can work. Unless you talk about very strict MPAs, such as the IUCN typology of MPAs goes from 1 to 6 and 1 to 3 are the most rigorous, and it might be that those 1 to 3 categories of MPAs need to be promoted more. Nico mentioned the BBNJ agreement. I think that's going to be incredibly important, because a very important part of the BBNJ agreement is enhanced cooperation. And that means that the RFMOs and the BBNJ treaty are going to have to cooperate more closely together. That's going to help. It's not quite getting to all the different multiple ocean uses, but I think that's an important component as well.
Great.
Yeah, I think that another component globally is the WTO subsidies agreement. At least in Mexico, for reasons that don't really have anything to do with the WTO agreement, but subsidies for fisheries disappeared in 2020 as per government policy. And we did see some fisheries that stopped operating just because they were not profitable if they weren't subsidized. So it was a real travesty that we were using Mexican taxpayer money to subsidize shrimp fishing fleets for cheap shrimp for U.S. consumers. And so I think that was a clear example where subsidies were not serving the public good in Mexico. And when they disappeared, we saw the impact.
Yeah. I would like to respond about the question plastic that I pop up in question and answer box. I think plastic pollution is already becoming a fisheries and food security issues across global, not only Southeast Asia. You mentioned that Indonesia and Philippines are both one of big problem about plastic issues. Like in Indonesia alone, many small-scale fishers now report catching plastic waste together with fish, while mangrove and coastal nursery area are increasingly polluted. But we also need to be honest that this is not only a consumer problem. A small number of multinational companies are responsible for a huge share of global plastic production and packaging waste that you mentioned, like Nestle and another brand. And yeah, so from our perspective, solution cannot rely on only for community itself. That if we expect that community clean up or awareness campaign, that's not enough. But we need also stronger corporate accountability, reduction or single-use plastic, and policy that make producer responsible for the full environmental cost of their product. Because healthy fisheries simply cannot exist without healthy coastal ecosystem. That's why, but in this forum also we need to strengthening our movement to again about plastic pollutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, this has been an incredibly rich conversation, and I see that we're at time, and so I'm going to pass over to Chris Vodiano to close us out for this session and also for the series.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kristen, and the panelists and presenters today. A sincere thank you to all those who engage in this rich discussion. I learned a lot personally, and thanks for everyone who joined today from around the world. As noted earlier, the published policy brief is available for reading. You can find that link in the chat. As Kristen mentioned, this marks our final session and webinar in this series, and we are so grateful for all the expertise that the panelists brought through thoughtful engagement from our audience. You can click the link in the chat to join our listserv, where we will be hosting the recordings of each webinar in this series. Those will be posted in the coming weeks. Videos will be shared via email from the Food Studies program at the New School. I also want to mention that the series was made possible by a remarkable coalition of co-hosts. I think we're going to post those in the chat too many to name, but there are co-hosts spanning from research institutions, civil society movements, multilateral bodies, and frontline organizations, each bringing distinct expertise to the shared task of confronting power inequities in our modern food systems. So over the course of the series, a common thread really did emerge that the future of food is really a shared one, and shaping it means confronting the power structures that determines who decides, who benefits, and who bears the cost. So thank you once again for being here at this closing session, and we hope to stay connected.